Today I will read you the story of my subscriber. If I were him, I wouldn't go there. The bar smelled like old wood, spilled beer, and something fried. A handful of locals were scattered around, leaning over their drinks, talking in low voices. I wasn't really listening, until I caught something that made me pause. Church out in the woods. Best not go poking around there. I turned my head slightly. A man in a trucker hat was talking to his buddy. His voice just low enough to make it sound like he didn't want others to hear. His friend scoffed. "Ain't no one dumb enough to go out there." The first guy snorted. "You'd be surprised." I was already interested. I'd been passing through this town on my way to nowhere in particular. It was one of those places you could drive past without even noticing. A gas station, a bar, a few houses, and a whole lot of trees. Nothing special. But something about the way they were talking got under my skin. I leaned in. "What's the deal with the church?" They both looked at me, then at each other. The trucker shook his head. "It's just an old place. Abandoned. Some folks say it ain't right." "Not right how?" A pause. Then, "People who go looking don't come back the same." That was enough for me. I wasn't superstitious and I didn't believe in ghost stories. But I'd always liked testing the kind of warnings that made others nervous. So, after finishing my drink, I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and made up my mind. I was going to see the church for myself. The bartender gave me a look when I asked for directions. Not a warning, just a look, like he already knew I wouldn't listen. He told me how to get there anyway. I left my car at the end of a dirt road, where the trees pressed in close on either side. The path ahead was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and half buried under fallen leaves. I checked my phone, no signal. Not surprising. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the uneven ground. I had expected a short walk, 15, maybe 20 minutes, but after what felt like at least half an hour, the church was still nowhere in sight. The air felt heavier somehow, and even though I knew I was heading in the right direction, something about the path seemed off, like it stretched longer than it should. I stopped for a second, glancing over my shoulder. The trail behind me seemed darker than before, the trees packed tighter. I could still go back, but I wouldn't. I kept walking. Then, finally, through a gap in the trees, I saw it, the silhouette of the church against the sky. It was smaller than I expected, with a pointed steeple and wooden walls that had gone gray with age. No lights, no movement, just an empty, forgotten building in the middle of the woods. Still, as I stepped closer, I felt it deep in my chest. Something about this place was wrong. I ignored the feeling and reached for the door. The door wasn't locked. As soon as I pushed, it gave way with a slow, aching creak. The sound stretched into the silence, making it feel like the whole building was exhaling after being closed up for too long. Inside, the air was stale and cold, far colder than it should have been on a summer night. The smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, dust, and something faintly like old paper. I stepped forward, my boots scuffing against the warped floorboards. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar, some missing chunks where the wood had rotted away. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, catching the dim light that filtered through the broken stained glass. At first glance, it was exactly what I expected, just an old, abandoned church. But then I noticed the objects left behind. A jacket draped over the back of a pew, like someone had just set it down and forgotten it. A backpack near the entrance, the zipper halfway open. A few crumpled sheets of paper scattered near the altar. None of it looked decades old. I swallowed, suddenly uneasy. If this place had been abandoned for years, then why did it look like someone had been here recently? I stepped toward the altar. The wood was cracked and splintered, but something had been left on top of it. An old, leather-bound notebook. I hesitated before picking it up. The cover was soft with age, the corners worn down. When I flipped it open, the pages crackled like they hadn't been touched in years. The handwriting inside was neat, precise. It looked like a record of church services. At first, the entries were normal dates, sermon topics, names of attendees. But as I flipped further, something changed. The handwriting became shakier, the notes shorter. Then one entry caught my eye. Something is wrong. I frowned and read on. The congregation, they forget things. Names, faces, where they live. They sit in silence during the service, staring at me like they don't know why they're here. Last Sunday, I asked Mrs. Holloway if she was feeling all right. She just blinked at me and said, "Who is Mrs. Holloway?" The next entries got worse. More forgotten names. More confusion. A growing sense of dread in the priest's words. Then the final entry. There is no service today. There is no congregation. I do not know my own name. I slowly lowered the notebook. The air inside the church felt heavier now, like the walls were pressing closer. I wasn't alone in here. I set the notebook down carefully, my fingers lingering on the worn leather for a moment longer than necessary. A deep, sinking feeling had settled in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe, to think. This was just an old book. Just the ramblings of a man who had probably lost his mind out here, isolated in the woods. That's what I told myself, anyway. But then my boot crunched against something. I looked down. Broken candle wax littered the floor, as if someone had smashed an entire row of them underfoot. Their jagged edges gleamed in the dim light, half melted into the wooden planks. A few still had wicks, burned down to blackened nubs. Then I saw the writing on the walls. Names, carved into the wood, scratched deep with something sharp. Some of them were old, their edges softened with time, while others looked fresh. So fresh that I swore I could see tiny curls of wood still clinging to the grooves. I stepped closer, running my fingers over one of the names. The indentations were rough, uneven, desperate. Some of the names were crossed out, not scratched out in a single, thoughtless motion, but deliberately with careful, forceful strokes. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the wall. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of names, some repeated, some fading into nothing. Then my gaze landed on one that sent ice through my veins. I knew it. I didn't know how, but I recognized it. The shape of it. The way it sat among the others. I tried to place where I'd seen it before, but my thoughts were suddenly sluggish, slipping through my fingers like sand. Something about this wasn't right. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. The church was dead silent. No wind, no creaking wood, nothing. Then, from the far end of the hall, a soft, deliberate step. The sound wasn't loud, just the faint creak of wood shifting under weight. But in the absolute silence of the church, it might as well have been a gunshot. I froze. The noise had come from the far end of the hall, near the entrance. I turned my head slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was nothing there. The door, the one I had left cracked open, was now closed. I was sure of it. I hadn't touched it. I would have remembered that, right? A cold prickle ran down my spine. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from the pews to the altar, to the shadows pooling in the corners. The place felt different now, like the air had shifted. I listened, held my breath. Nothing. Maybe it was just the building settling. That's what old places did. They made noise. That was normal. I told myself that, but I didn't believe it. Because when I looked back at the notebook on the altar, the pages were moving. Not flipping wildly, not stirred by a sudden gust of wind. Just shifting, ever so slightly, as if someone were running their fingers along the edges. But there was no one there. I took a step back. My boots scraped against the wood, and the sound echoed too loudly in the empty space. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my breathing steady. I needed to leave. I turned toward the door, gripping the handle. It didn't budge. I yanked the door handle harder. Nothing. The wood didn't even rattle in its frame. Locked. I let go and stepped back, shaking out my hands. My palms were damp. My heart was hammering so hard it made my fingers tremble. Okay, breathe. Maybe the door had swollen shut from moisture. Maybe I hadn't noticed it was jammed when I came in. Maybe. My eyes flicked to my watch. 1 a.m. I blinked. That wasn't right. I could have sworn it was 10 o'clock when I walked in. Maybe a little past, but not much. I hadn't been here for 3 hours. That was impossible. I rubbed my temples, trying to push through the fog creeping into my thoughts. Had I lost track of time? That didn't make sense. I hadn't even done anything except look around. Read the notebook. I checked my phone. The screen was black. I pressed the power button, but it didn't respond. The battery hadn't been low when I left the car. I was sure of that. But now it was dead. I stared at the door again. The wood looked darker than before. Not just in the dim light, like it had aged, like it had been sitting here untouched for years. A new thought slid into my head, cold and unwelcome. Had I really only been here for a few minutes? Or had it been longer? I turned back to the room. The pews stretched out before me, silent and empty. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the idea that I had lost time, or the feeling that something else had taken it from me. Either way, I had to get out. I moved fast now, crossing the room in quick, deliberate strides. There had to be another way out. There were side doors, I was sure of it. I had seen them when I first walked in. Small ones along the walls, maybe leading to storage rooms or an office. Maybe even a back exit. I grabbed the nearest handle and twisted. Locked. I moved to the next. Same thing. I tried all of them, one by one, each time with a little more force. The doors didn't even rattle in their frames. They weren't just stuck. They were sealed like they had never been meant to open at all. My breathing quickened. Okay. The windows. I turned my gaze upward. The stained glass windows lining the church walls were too high to reach. Even if I stacked the pews, I doubted I could break through them. And something about the way they looked, their colors faded and warped, made me uneasy, like they weren't showing anything real anymore. I swallowed hard. There was no way out. That realization settled over me like a weight, pressing into my ribs. I had walked in freely. The door had opened for me. But now I wasn't sure it ever would again. The silence stretched, pressing against my ears. My heartbeat was too loud, my breath coming short and shallow. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the room. There had to be something I was missing. Then, at the far end of the hall, I saw it. A door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, just enough to show the darkness beyond. But that wasn't possible, because it was where the basement entrance should have been. And I knew, without a doubt, that this church didn't have a basement. I stared at the open door. It wasn't just that the church wasn't supposed to have a basement. It was that I had looked at this exact wall when I first walked in. It had been solid wood, unbroken. But now there was a door, and behind it, a corridor stretched into the dark. I took a step forward before I could stop myself. The air was different here, thicker, like stepping into a room where someone had been breathing too long with no ventilation. My skin prickled. I reached for my phone instinctively, but the dead screen was useless. No light, no signal. My foot crossed the threshold. The floor changed beneath me. The wooden planks of the church gave way to something colder, harder. Stone. I swallowed. This didn't make sense. From the outside, the church was small. There was no way a corridor like this could fit inside. But it was here, and something was waiting at the end of it. I couldn't see anything, not yet. Just the heavy darkness pressing in. But I felt it. Presence. A weight. The air hummed with it. I should have turned back. I wanted to turn back. But the moment I stepped into the corridor, I knew I had already gone too far. Because the door behind me, it swung shut. The sound of the door closing was soft, almost careful. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The door was gone. Not closed. Not locked. Gone. The wall behind me was smooth stone, unbroken. No seams, no hinges. Like the exit had never existed at all. I swallowed hard. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my skin like damp fabric. The corridor stretched ahead, the darkness so thick it seemed to drink in what little light there was. Then movement. At the far end of the corridor, just barely visible in the gloom, stood a girl. She wasn't moving. She wasn't speaking. Just standing there. Even from this distance, I could feel it. She knew I was here. A slow, creeping dread curled around my ribs, tightening. She looked young, maybe early 20s. long, dark hair hanging loose over her shoulders. Her dress, something simple, old-fashioned, blended too easily with the shadows, making it hard to tell where she ended and the darkness began. I tried to speak. My throat was dry. "Hello?" Nothing. She didn't react. Didn't twitch, didn't shift, didn't breathe. Just stood there, perfectly still. Something was deeply, deeply wrong. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to run. But there was nowhere to go. And then, somewhere above me, deep in the church, a bell started ringing. The first chime came slow and deep, reverberating through the church like a heartbeat. It shouldn't have been possible. I had seen the bell when I entered. No rope, no mechanism, just an old, rusted husk hanging in the tower. But now it was ringing. The girl at the end of the corridor shifted. Not a step, not a movement, just closer. I hadn't blinked, hadn't looked away. But the space between us was smaller now. Too small. Another chime. She was even closer. The dim light flickered over her face, and I finally saw it. Her skin was wrong. Not smooth. Not natural. More like old wax too long in the sun. Her lips barely parted, her breath shallow, like she was on the verge of whispering something. I stepped backward. The bell rang again, slower this time. It echoed unnaturally, like it wasn't coming from above, but from inside the walls. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My fingers clenched at my sides, every nerve screaming that I shouldn't be here, that I never should have come. The girl shifted again. The light bent around her. Her limbs didn't move, but the distance between us kept disappearing. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but then I felt it. The pressure behind me. Something was standing right there. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. The air behind me was too thick, too present, like a mass pushing into my spine, bending the space around me. The girl wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me. And I knew, in that moment, that whatever was behind me wasn't just standing still. It was leaning in. My body locked up. I felt the presence behind me shift, the air pressing tighter against my back, like something enormous was bending closer. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The girl was still watching, her waxy lips twitching, trying to form words that never came. The bell rang again, long, slow, drawn out, as if something was dragging it down. Then the whisper came, not from the girl, not from the church, but from directly behind me. "Don't turn around." My heart slammed against my ribs. The voice was low, hollow, like a breath rattling through a space where lungs shouldn't be. Something unseen brushed the back of my neck, cold and dry like fingertips made of bone. I clenched my fists. I knew what this was. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was waiting for me to make a mistake. Every part of me screamed to bolt, to run, to get away. But where? The doors were gone. The church had swallowed them. The girl was still blocking the corridor, her body shifting closer in unnatural jumps. The presence behind me was expecting me to turn around. But what if I did the opposite? I inhaled sharply, forcing my shaking legs to move forward instead, toward the girl. Her expression didn't change, but the air around her seemed to vibrate, as if I had broken some unspoken rule. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Don't." I didn't stop. One step, another. I was 3 feet from her now. Her breath hitched. Her lips finally moved. But before she could speak, the bell screamed, louder than before. Wrong. The sound cracked through the walls, the air, my skull, and then everything collapsed. Darkness. Pure, suffocating darkness. It swallowed the church, the girl, the corridor. Everything collapsed inward like a camera shutter snapping closed. And then I saw it. Not the girl. Not a figure. Not even a shape that made sense. Just a hole in the world. Deeper than black. Deeper than anything that should exist. It wasn't empty. It was watching me back. And the moment I saw it, pulled. I felt my body lurch forward. My limbs snapping back like I was being yanked out of reality itself. My mind screamed, but there was no sound, no breath, no air, just falling. 1,000 voices whispered, but they weren't words. They were names. Names carved into the walls. Names crossed out. I knew them. I was one of them. And then, impact. I gasped. My body jolted upright, my hands slamming against wood. No darkness. No stone. No corridor. A bar. The bar. The scent of fried food and stale beer filled my nose. The low hum of voices. The distant twang of a country song playing on the jukebox. My stool. My drink. My shaking hands gripping the counter. Like I had never left. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heart still hammering. Had I imagined it? Had I ever left? Slowly, stiffly, I lifted my wrist. 1 a.m. The time hadn't changed. A shadow moved in my periphery. I turned my head and froze. The girl was sitting in a booth near the back, half hidden in the dim light. Still, silent, watching. Her lips barely parted, like she was about to speak. Something moved in front of me. Tom, the bartender. He was watching me carefully, his rag still wiping the inside of a glass, slow and steady. His voice was too casual. "So," he said, "did you make it to the church?" The words knocked the air out of me. I tried to swallow, but my throat was too tight. He nodded at my wrist. "Check your watch." I didn't move, because I already knew. The time would never change. I would always be here, because I never really left. And maybe I never would.